Good morning. I'm delighted to be able to share some ideas with you this morning at the last day of this marvelous conference. It has been really a feast of ideas and inspiring moments and rich, rich material to process for all of us, I think. I want to talk today about sufficiency, and I've entitled it Willingly Sliding Down the Slope, because we need to find ways to decrease our consumption, slide down the slope. And the first part of the talk will be about sufficiency briefly, and the second part about narratives, and in particular how those might be used in an effective way in games. So sustainability, as we all know, is a normative aspiration for just and equitable well-being within the limits of available resources, natural resources, both for the present and for future human society, which we have to also see as an integral part of all living systems. But we have increasing population, we have rising consumption among many, in contrast to dire insufficiency, barely survivability among many others. And we are reaching critical resource limits, which all point to the urgent need for sufficiency, but also sufficiency that is appropriate to issues of equity and cultural differentiation. So the goal might be best said as being, how do we improve well-being of society through both sufficiency and efficiency? We need both of these, because if the system in which we hope to be sufficient is highly inefficient, we will not be able to restrict the use of the resources. So sufficiency is a subjective, a cultural, a contextual issue, whereas efficiency is broadly technological. One way to look at all this, to schematically indicate this, was drawn by Carolyn Zim when we put together the third report to the UN High-Level Political Forum in July of 2020. And it really emphasizes the idea of decent living standards, which is meant to mean that, number one, it is built on sufficiency and resource requirements, as you see in the bottom of this sort of pyramid, if you will, funnel. It deals with needs, abilities, and opportunities in the familiar presentation. But by focusing on decent living standards, that's an approach to dealing with the very different contexts and cultures in which this has to be enacted. But that's the point which gets difficult. How do we reach sufficiency without behavior change? We have to change behaviors to become sufficient. And what tools do we have to foster and guide behavior change? Well, we can push, we can give information, we can have dialogues, regulations, what you can and cannot do, or should not do. We can have persuasion, we can have the norms, which are the should. But we also have to avoid falling into the trap of the information deficit that's long been shown to be poorly effective at best. And the fact that we haven't even learned our own lesson of that is a pretty good indication of that. We still try to hand people knowledge and then expect them to make use of that. What we need is to find a way to really engage rather than teach or be didactic, and to reach even those who are not interested in sustainability per se, or to begin with. So what we can do is try to pull them into engagement, to motivate people to want to learn through their curiosity, active participation, and inquiry. And that one way to address that desire to pull people in, to engage them, is to build affective engagement, that is, pull on emotional issues, not only on cognitive matters, cognitive processing, through narratives and narrative-driven games. Narratives, people are familiar with it, or it's used frequently as a term, but let me just be a little more specific. Yes, they have a story and they have characters and a scene, a context, but that context is crucial, and they have also a sense of orientation and a normative purpose. So they are not just the story, but they are why that story has meaning for the intended audience. Narratives are expressed in many forms, not just as long speeches or sermons or whatever, or literature written. It's dance, it's myths, it's storytelling, it's paintings, it's songs, it's drama. One category of narratives that has particularly interested me, particularly in the Knowledge Learning Societal Change Alliance that I've led for the last dozen years, now known as Classica, are narratives of social identities, which reflect and help maintain culture on one hand, and which also act as motivation, sort of provocation and motivation of actions in accord with the group with which that social identity is connected. It can be a group or community of different forms, including online. So it's a kind of in-group versus the others, or us versus the others aspect to that. An example, foods as narratives of social identity, it caught my attention in the last issue of the EOS Science News from the American Geophysical Union. A quote, indigenous food knowledge networks network connects indigenous and non-indigenous scholars, community members, and leaders from the Alaskan and Canadian Arctic and subarctic and the US Southwest to co-produce food sovereignty solutions. And the quote that I found also very relevant from what we've been talking, it's not just something we physically eat, but it's part of our ceremonies. It's our connection to the land, to our non-human kin. So in that sense, it's an integral part. Food itself is an integral part of social identity. There are many other parts that are connected. The other important sort of category here with narratives is narratives of vision. And I'll take the example with foods. Narratives of vision provide a reason and an orientation for acting to move towards a particular future. For example, in the indigenous community of autonomous, post-colonial, thriving societies, maintaining culture. And a particular example, a friend and colleague of mine that I worked with the Arctic Council, working group on sustainable development, is Anders Oskal, who's director of the International Center for Reindeer Husbandry. And he uses and articulates very powerfully a narrative of vision of improving the well-being of Arctic peoples by maintaining the culture of foods across the Pan-Arctic region, drawing on these different cultural aspects, but with the common framework of the vision of becoming independent towards their own well-being as they use their cultural heritage. So where do narratives then offer, what do they offer us? How can we use them in games? They are used in games. There are many narrative, role-playing, narrative-driven games. But just to take a couple of pieces of this a little further, a key element in drama of any sort is a particular kind of tension that holds the story together and the audience in that dramatic arc of tension, building, and resolving. The focus, though, in my view, in terms of using the narratives in a game, is not on the scene or the story broadly. Those, of course, are important, characters, etc., but specifically on the protagonist, who in a sense embodies and enacts the tension. And the narratives of vision, narrative or narratives of vision, are the driver for the protagonist seeking to bring change to a community or society, seeking to accomplish something. And that narrative of vision is what is, in a sense, driving the protagonist. Why the protagonist? Because that is with whom the observer, the player, the audience, whatever, becomes really engaged. It's not just about hearing something, but again, particularly if we're thinking about a game, becoming engaged because that vision of that protagonist is in question, is at risk as you engage in the game. At the same time, the protagonist is struggling with the constraints and, in some cases, the affordances of narratives of identity and social norms. So, who is the protagonist in the game is part of understanding, as a game player, something about that protagonist's identity in the context of the game, and dealing with what that provides the protagonist, but also how it constrains the protagonist. And the struggle then is to get to both, for the protagonist to overcome the barriers and the constraints to reach the vision that the protagonist has, and for the player to understand and make sense of the narratives of vision and of the identities, or identity that's dominant, of the protagonist, in order to be able to essentially take on the role of the protagonist successfully. So I would challenge us to embed meaningful narratives in games to improve the pull of games for sufficiency, efficiency, and ultimately sustainability. Will this help us slide willingly down the slope to sufficiency? I think it may. I think it could help with certain groups and maybe many, but it depends very much on how that is specifically crafted. Thank you.